We're going to be looking at the mind-body connection today, and this is actually quite an interesting study. And I think that David had an idea of what he was talking about when he mentioned in Psalm 139, verse 14, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well." Right? Now, perhaps he had an idea of what was going on with the mind and body when he wrote this. He was an observer of people, and I wouldn't be surprised if he did have some of these ideas, but science gives us some pretty interesting insights into this mind of ours and how it impacts our body. The brain, human brain weighs around 3.5 pounds. Men, your brain weighs around 3.5 pounds. Ladies, yours weighs around 3 pounds. I heard the what? Yeah, it's true, but it's just because ladies tend to be smaller than men. If you were the same size as men on average, then your brain would be the same size. All right. So about 3.5 pounds of brain, but inside that brain you have somewhere from 80 to 120 billion neurons. These are the nerve cells that communicate information from one location to another, that are involved in interpreting things and thoughts and other stuff like that. And of those neurons, the average neuron has over 7,000 synaptic connections. These are the little connections that go from one spot to another that communicate information between the different cells. All right? So over 7,000 per neuron. And it's estimated that a 4-year-old child has somewhere around 1 quadrillion synaptic connections. Now, I'm not sure exactly how to communicate quadrillion. It's after trillion. That's 1,000 trillion, which is a million billion, which is a billion million, which is a trillion thousands, and you get the. It's just humongous. But by the time you are an adult, you have somewhere between 100 to 500 trillion synaptic connections. So only 1/10 to 1/2 of the synaptic connections that you had as a 4-year-old. But that's probably a good thing, because if you were like a 4-year-old, we'd be in trouble, right? You'd be distracted and all over the place, and just all wired and whatever. So it's actually a good thing that it kind of pares down, and it depends on the environment that you're in as to which of the neurons actually continue living and which ones don't. The ones that you use continue on, and the ones that you don't need to use in your particular environment don't necessarily go on from that standpoint. Now, by the age of 20, you have approximately 160,000 kilometers of myelinated axons in the body. Now, this is the cell body up here. Can you see my cursor running around up there? Yeah? All right, I'm just making sure it's projecting over there. All right. So this top part up here is the cell body, and then usually you get information around here in these little spiky parts called the dendrites, and then the information will get communicated down this long piece here called the axon to its little terminals, and then it'll fire off and signal to other locations, all right? And usually what happens is when you get a signal over here, the signal will go along the surface of the cell, and so it'll kind of go boom, to the other end, and then boom, fire off another chemical signal. But you have this myelin sheath that's around it, and the myelin sheath is kind of like insulation. Right? It's like insulation around the wiring, except this is like, I guess, beads of insulation along the wiring. You have these little spaces in between called the nodes of Ranvier. And what it does is, instead of causing, like in your house, wiring keeps things from going zzz, zzz, and then fires in your walls and that kind of stuff. Well, in this case, the wiring actually helps things to go faster, signals to go faster. So in this case, you would have a signal with the myelin. You go, and so communication goes faster from one end to the other. And you can see this process happening if you have a child that's developing, right? So if you've got a baby that's developing, and let's say, for instance, you've got a 3-week-old child, right? You can get your 3-week-old child, put them on the table, and go walk away and do something and wash your hands and whatever, and then you can come back and get your little 3-week-old from the, I'm not advising this, I'm just saying you can, right? You could, you know, and the baby's right there, and it's going to be right there because it can't do anything. I mean, it can cry and it can have a startle response, but it's not going to roll over, it's not going to walk up, it's not going to go, oh, shame on you, mommy, and walk off the table, right? No, right? It's there. But as the baby develops and starts getting more connections, more myelination that's going on, you get a 3-month-old and you put them there, well, there's a little bit more chance that they might be able to do something. Usually it's around 4 months to 5 months that they actually learn to roll over. And then by the time you get around 6 months, they're able to sit up when you sit them up, or at least stay sitting up when you sit them up, right? And then around 9 months, they can kind of begin to crawl, and they can put their finger and their thumb together and have that pincher reflex. And then somewhere around a year to 15 months or so, they start learning how to walk, right? And so all of this is actually an indication that you're getting more and more myelination in the nerves because you're getting faster and faster communication from one end to the other. It is a complex process to just stand. Very complex. You've got sensory nerves that are giving you information, let's say for instance in the knee joints. In your lateral compartment, you've got nerves that are telling you how much pressure is happening in the bones or in the joints in that area versus the medial compartment. So you get an idea of differential weights that's going on. You've got nerve endings that are in the tendons and the muscles that tell how much is being stretched or being relaxed. And so all this information is being relayed to the base of the brain to tell you what's going on as far as balance is concerned. And if you've got slow communication, you can't adjust things fast enough to stay up, and so you fall down. But once you get enough of this insulation going on, the child has enough communication where they can start actually responding to these signals that are going on, and then they can stand up. And we've got an almost 12-month-old right now. So she's doing that. She's pulling herself up on things, and we got a little walker for her a couple days ago, you know, that she can walk behind, and she'll let go of it and then kind of sit down, right? She hasn't taken any steps yet. That's coming soon, but she's myelinating, you know, so there's this process that's going on. So 160,000 kilometers of myelinated axons in your body. That's a lot, right? That's a big trip. The brain is a powerhouse. It only represents about 2% of the body's weight, but it receives 15% of the blood coming from the heart, the cardiac output. It receives 20% of the oxygen that the body uses, and 25% of the blood sugar. All right? And it does that, I mean, it takes all of these resources because it's a generator, right? It actually does generate electrical activity, right? And electrical stimuli for the rest of the body. And the brain is the control center, interpreting, receiving, directing sensory and motor information throughout the entire body. And it does this through complex mechanisms that don't just involve lots and lots of nerves. And you remember we talked about axons? Axons are, if you put hundreds or thousands of axons together and bundle them together, it's called a nerve. Right? A nerve is just hundreds or thousands of axons that are bundled together. And so you've got lots and lots of nerves through the body carrying information from the body to the brain, from the brain back to the body. But not only that, you also have neurohormonal signaling systems where, let's say for instance, you've got the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system. You're on safari in Africa. And you're going out and you're getting pictures, you know, and you see this the zebra off in the distance, you know, and you're going and you're clicking pictures and you're doing all that kind of stuff, and you know, you're kind of wandering away and the truck's like way over there, and then all of a sudden you turn around and you can see a big kitty licking its lips, right? Then you go, uh-oh, and you look at the kitty, and you look at the truck, and you look at the kitty, and you look at the truck, and you go, oh, let's see. Can I make it back to the truck before the kitty can make it to me, you know? And then you've got adrenaline, you've got epinephrine, norepinephrine that's going on, and boom, you run faster than you've ever run in your life. Right? And you hope somebody else threw their camera at the kitty before it got to you, right? Well, that signal, the sympathetic nervous system, signals the adrenal glands directly to release epinephrine or adrenaline. You know, most people know it as adrenaline. So epinephrine gets released into the system, and it gets into the bloodstream and goes everywhere. And it bathes every tissue in the body with that. And so the brain really is in contact with every different cell of the body, at least in some way, in some form, right, so that it can control it. The brain has two what we call hemispheres. Hemi means half and sphere means circle, half circles. This is actually would be the representation of a person whose brain is looking at you, right? So this would be the right side of their brain, and this is the left side of their brain. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So if you have somebody who has a stroke and their right side isn't working very well, the stroke happened on the left side of the brain for the most part. All right? It crosses at a particular point, and if it's below that point, then it can be the same side. But most of the brain is that way. And you've ever heard of individuals that are left-brained or right-brained? Right? Left-brained or right-brained has to do with whether your language centers are located on the left hemisphere of the brain or on the right hemisphere of the brain. So it has to do with language dominance. And about 90% of individuals are left-brained. And most individuals who are left-brained are right-handed. And a higher percentage of individuals who are left-handed are right-brained. But it doesn't necessarily go together, right? But there are certain functions on the left side of the brain that you don't necessarily have on the right side, and certain functions on the right side that you don't necessarily have on the left side. But if you're really young, you can compensate for problems, right? Like at Johns Hopkins University, they found out that if you have intractable seizures, one of the things that they can do is they can do a hemicraniectomy. So they can remove half of the brain, and it takes care of the abnormal seizures, and if you do it young enough in children, then they can compensate for that and still function relatively well throughout life. If you did it in you or I, right? Yeah, no, we're set in our ways, right? We don't have that much chance to compensate from that. The brain has a number of different locations to it. And let's just start here from the bottom. This red blob at the bottom, that's called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is responsible for motor coordination and balance. Remember what we talked about, just standing and getting all that information from the joints and the muscles and everything, what we call proprioception? All of that gets integrated through the cerebellum. And when your brain says, all right, I want to stop and turn around, the cerebellum, what does it do? It incorporates all this information from the body to come up with a smooth plan of how you're going to do that. So if you're just standing still and your cerebrum says, all right, I want to turn around and go that way, the cerebellum says, okay, you need to do this, 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 and this in order to do that well. And then a signal goes back to the cerebrum, and the cerebrum says, okay, and we maneuver that. And so you turn around and you go. But if you're running full bore this direction, and you want to stop and turn around the other way, an entirely different set of things has to happen, right? You've got to take into consideration your momentum and how fast you're going and what's going on and that kind of stuff. You've got to throw your weight back, you've got to slow down, you've got to, different pressure differences and that kind of stuff before you can then turn around and go the other direction. So the cerebellum is responsible for making all of those things happen. The occipital lobe, which is right here in the back, is where your primary visual cortex is. So you got eyeballs in the front and vision processing in the back. Why? I don't know. God made us that way, and it works, right? Yeah, it works, If you have good functioning eyeballs, but you have a big stroke back here in the back of the brain, guess what? You're blind, right? You got to have the brain part of it in order to have vision, even if you've got good functioning eyeballs that are there. Right. This area right here on the side, the lighter blue, is a temporal lobe, and that's predominantly speech, hearing, and memory. All right, so individuals who have strokes in this area a lot of times can hit their speech centers, and so it's difficult for them to speak, or it's difficult for them to understand speech, or if they hit both of those areas, then they have problems with both, right? Memory is deep inside there, the hippocampus and the amygdala. And so those are predominantly there with the temporal lobe. Here in the parietal lobe, the green area back here, that's more sensory processing, manipulating numbers, visual spatial processing, so your accountants live there. If I want to figure out how to get back to our table in the back, I've got to figure out about getting around the podium here. I've got to figure out how much of a drop I need to step off here to get down, and navigating around the chairs and so on and so forth. That's visual spatial processing. And then sensory processing. You know, you've got the hammer and a nail, and you're going bang, 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 bang. Whoops, wrong nail. Ow, 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 ow. Right? That sensory processing is there in the parietal lobe. And then you have the frontal lobe, which has your primary motor cortex right here in the back, which is your output stuff, you know, where you're moving and doing that kind of stuff. But most of this frontal lobe is your executive functions. So forethought, self-control, planning, judgment, other things like that. This is the brakes on the system, right? Everything else is kind of like animal type of stuff. You've got inputs, you've got outputs. But the frontal lobe is where you can evaluate the inputs that are coming in, put them within the context of something and say, oh, hang on, last time I did this happened and I didn't like that. So this time I'm not going to do it, right? Or I was reading in my Bible and so did this very thing, and this is what happened in their life. And I don't want that consequence, so I'm not going to go there, right? So even though my impulse might be to go do something, the frontal lobe is the area that God can look at controlling and saying, okay, no, this is where morality resides, is right there in the frontal lobes, you know? I mean, my natural inclination is to you know, eat whatever and sleep around with whoever and do, you know, whatever. And all of this kind of stuff, but it's there that God brings the control where I can say, oh, no, all right, let's stop. So it's the brakes of the system, right? And so this is a lot of stuff that we've been talking about the brain, but then my question is, what is the mind? What's the mind? And is it the same thing as the brain? Well, nowadays, if you've got a question about something, you can always go online and you can look it up, or you got a smartphone and you got Siri or whatever, you can just ask her, Siri, what's the mind, you know? So I went online to Google and I Googled mind, what is the mind? And it brought me to Wikipedia. And so Wikipedia told me the mind is the complex of cognitive faculties that enables consciousness, thinking, reasoning, perception, and judgment. I think it's a good description. You know, reasoning, yeah, all right, judgment, yeah, consciousness, okay, thinking, yeah, perception, all right. So these are all different types of things that we can use to describe it, but how do we put our finger on it, right? Well, we get an idea, at least in different areas of the brain where things light up under functional MRIs or PET scanning or other types of things like that, so we're getting an idea of which parts of brains light up under different activities, but what is a moral value assessment? You know, if you think something's wrong, what is that? I mean, is it a chemical? Is it a cell? Is it the way different cells are connected together? On a physiologic anatomic basis, what is it? We don't know. We don't know. We just don't know. Do you think? I think, therefore I am. You know you think because you think. But we still don't know what a thought is. Don't have a clue, right? So is the brain the same thing as the mind? Is the mind the same thing as the brain? This has been a philosophical debate for years. How can you take electrical and chemical stimulations of things like synaptic connections to derive retrieve a memory, or derive an opinion, or make a moral value assessment like murder is wrong, right? But you can't separate the two. I'm just going to tell you my theory, and this is a theory. You can take it, leave it, you know, chew on it, spit it out, do whatever you want to. My theory is that the mind is what we call the spirit, right? It's that part of you that's ethereal. You can't put your finger on it. It's kind of like the breath of God. You know, you got it, and you know that you got it, And it's there, and it resides in the brain, right? It resides in the brain, in that organ, and if you damage the body or the brain, you damage its ability to function, and if you damage it, you damage the brain's ability to function. The two go hand in hand, and if you destroy the one, you've destroyed the other two. But they're not necessarily the same thing, but you can't separate them, right? Again, that's just a theory, just a theory. We started this whole debate of brain and mind and all of that kind of stuff really got kicked into gear back in September 13, 1848. Anybody recognize this guy? Phineas Gage. Yeah, Phineas Gage. I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day, right? He was a railroad foreman, and he was working on the railroad, and of course, trains can't get up a steep slope or go down a steep slope because they don't have enough brakes or enough traction to be able to do that. So it's got to be relatively level. And so if you're going through the mountains, you've got to make a track that's relatively level to go through. And so if there's mountains in the way, you need to get them out of the way. And one way you can do that is get a pick and an axe, but that takes a long time. And a more fun way of getting rid of it, dynamite. That's right, explosives. You know, guys like playing with this kind of stuff. Oh, yeah. You know? So he's working with explosives. And in this case, what you do is you drill a hole down into the rock, and then you put your explosives down there, and then you put stuff on top of it, and you pack it in there and jam it tight. Right? Because if you don't, it's like a Roman candle. You stick it down in there, and then you just light it, and boom, comes out the end of the hole, right? So you got to pack it in there. And so that thing that he's holding there is his tamping iron. It's a 13.5-pound iron rod. And so you get the stuff down there, and you pack, and then you go detonate the thing and light it off. Well, he was going pack, bam! And the shot went off, and his rod went about 30, 40 feet behind him. And in the process, it went through his head. Yeah, it went through the cheek right here, and then up through the jaw, up through the orbital cavity, so he lost his left eye, and then right out of the head right up here. All right, and it's just sailing by. And unlike you or I, Phineas kind of sat up after the incident and probably said something like, ouch. And the guys looked at him, and they probably said something like, man, you ought to go home. You know, there was no hospitals to send him to, and so they got him in the stagecoach. They sent him home, and then they did the next best thing. They called the doctor, and then the doctor came, and the doctor did what they did in those days, and he got his fingers and he stuck them in places, because he didn't think it went through his head until he stuck his fingers in there, and he realized he didn't have his left frontal lobe anymore. And it was kind of rocky, but after about 12 to 14 days, he started to recover, and he lived for another 12 and a half years afterwards. But the reports of Phineas Gage is that his attitude, his behavior, his morals were quite a bit different afterwards than they were before, right? He wasn't quite the Christian young gentleman that he had been previously. And then that's, kind of fired this debate in regards to the mind and the brain. Because like in the Old Testament, it talks about the bowels of mercy. So there's these ideas of, the seat of the emotions being the bowels. And of course we talk about the heart, and I love you with all my heart, You love me with your blood pumping organ, No, it's really in the mind, it's really in the brain. And so this debate was going on from there. And of course we know now, obviously, things are situated in the brain. You've got psychoactive medications, we've got functional MRI scanning, you've got individuals with infections in the brain, and they get all haywire, and then you take care of the infection and they get back to their normal self, right? And so undoubtedly there's this connection between the brain and the mind. But the mind, again, is kind of this ethereal thing that you can't really put your finger on, not necessarily anatomic and physiologic, but it impacts physiology. And we see this happening in this thing called stress, right? Any of you had that? Oh, only 5 of you. Oh, all right, a few more of you have had stress. All right, yeah. I've had it too. That's why I'm getting this kind of white stuff that's growing in here, right? So we know, research is very conclusive, we know that if you've got stress, then that impacts negatively things like headaches. It impacts things like insomnia. It contributes to things like heart attacks and asthma and high blood pressure and acid reflux. There's very real physical responses to a mind issue of psychosocial stress. But how does that happen? Well, the research is actually starting to give us an idea of what the pathways are. When you have chronic emotional stress or psychosocial stress, it actually impacts your steroid receptors. You have steroid hormones that are released from the adrenal glands, and those have your cells in your body have receptors to those steroid hormones. And if you overdo the steroid hormones a lot because of all of this stress, then those receptors get blunted and they don't work like they should. And then it starts impacting your immune system, and the inflammatory cascade gets out of control, and then you end up with runaway inflammation. So there's a very real pathway whereby you have psychosocial stress that then leads to physical inflammation in the body, right? And if you want a short list of things that are associated with inflammation, there you go, all right? If you got anything that ends with the term itis, then there's inflammation that's associated with it, right? And so there's a whole bunch of different ways that stress or mind issues can impact your body through this cascade of inflammation, right? There's this term, or this quote, I should say, Counsels on Health, page 324, that I've come across a number of times, and the more I come across it, the more I appreciate it. Sickness of the mind prevails everywhere. 9/10 of the diseases from which men suffer have their foundation here. 9/10? What? 9/10? 9 out of 10, 90%? All right, how many are in here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, anyways. So we'll just count to 9, right? And then all of you are affected, 10th person goes free. Count to 9, all of you are affected, 10th person goes free. Count to 9, so on and so forth. So we got a few people that are exempt in this auditorium, and everybody else is suffering from issues of the mind, right? Well, that's what it's saying. How is it that it could be that way? How could it be so pervasive? I scratched my head about this for a while, and then finally I realized, you know what it is? It's choice. Choice is an issue of the mind, right? And most of us get into our issues because of choice. I choose to eat what I eat because it tastes good, and I do it for a long time, but it isn't good. And then the effect is bad, right? And so on and so forth. And so we end up getting in our troubles that way. There's the 9/10 that's not that way. You know, you were going for a nice bike ride and somebody wasn't looking and bam, they hit you with their car. You got real issues going on, physical stuff. Health is not great, and it wasn't your mind that was the problem, right? It was their car and their bumper and your leg, you know. So it's not all of it, but 9/10 of the diseases. Research is now showing that negative thoughts actually stimulate certain neurotransmitters, which then impact neurochemical pathways that influence gene expression. Yeah, when I first saw this, I was doing that too. I was like, oh, really? You know what that's saying? That's saying that your thoughts can change the expression of your genes. Wow. Yeah, and that's what the research is coming up with. Your thoughts can change the expression of your genes. Wow. Huh. Maybe there's another way that our thoughts are impacting our disease states. Maybe. There's an interesting study that was done, University of North Carolina, and no, Dr. Obama wasn't part of the class. But anyways, what they did in this study is they gave their medical students this thing called the Cook-Medley Hostility Scale test. All right? And it measures different levels of hostility. Now, hostility is not just walking up to somebody and punching them and telling them that you hate them and walking away, right? hostility has a number of different levels. Like, say, for instance, you need to go shopping and you've got 3 items that you need to get, and you go into the store and you grab your little hand basket and you go boom, boom, boom. You get your 3 items and you're going to check out, and you go to the 10 items or less fast checkout aisle, and while you're getting there, somebody pulls in front of you with their basket. Question number 1, do you count? That's a hostility response. You look in their cart and start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and then they've got a bag of apples. How many apples are in the bag? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. You know. Counting is a hostility response. Then do you go to the next level of hostility? Like, miss, they've got 18 items in their cart and it's only a 10 item or less aisle. And then the next level of hostility where both of you are sharing words, and then sharing fingernails, and then sharing handcuffs. Right? You know, there's various different levels of hostility. And so this Cook-Medley hostility scale is measuring different levels of hostility to contrived situations. And what they did is they had 255 of their medical school students that were taking this test. Average age of the class was 25. And then they followed them up for 25 years. Because alumni of medical schools love the medical schools love their alumni, because what do? They make money later on in life. Unless they go to UT Pines, then they don't, but that's okay. But then, you know, so they get them, they give the test, and then they line up the test scores from least hostile to most hostile, and then they just cut it in half, all right? Most hostile over here, least hostile over here. And what did they find? They found that the half of the class that was the most hostile were 5 times more likely to develop heart disease by the age of 50, and 6 times more likely to die. Wow. If we take this, if this information could be extrapolated to the population as a whole, then hostility is a stronger risk factor for cardiovascular disease than high blood pressure, than smoking, than diabetes, than a strong family history, than hypertension. Did I say that? Yeah, I said that already. Than high cholesterol, than any other risk factor that we know of. And in fact, all of the risk factors combined. Hostility. Wow. An issue of the mind, but a very real impact on the body, right? They did the same study with lawyers, and they found that of the least hostile half of the class, 4% were dead by the age of 50. Of the most hostile half of the class, 20% were dead by the age of 50. All right? So hostility has a very real, significant impact on one's health and longevity. But it's an issue of the mind. Right? But it's not just stress and hostility. Loneliness is also an impact on our health. This is Kakiopo. Kakiopo is one of the leading researchers in loneliness, and Kakiopo says that loneliness not only alters behavior, but loneliness is related to greater resistance to blood flow through your cardiovascular system. And I'll just give you the short and skinny. If there's more resistance, you got to have more pressure to push it through, right? Loneliness leads to higher rises in morning levels of the stress hormone cortisol, altered gene expression in immune cells, poorer immune function, higher blood pressure, and an increased level of depression. And everybody knows you don't have to be alone to be lonely, right? You can be lonely in a crowd. And so many physical effects associated with loneliness, and that's just an issue of the mind, right? You can be in a crowd and be lonely. Right? Stress and cancer. Well, the research is pretty clear. The more stress you have, the more likely you are to develop cancer. And if you have cancer, the more likely you're not to do well with it, and more likely you're to succumb to the cancer, right? So one of the things that you need to do if you've got cancer is to reduce the stress. And sometimes it is stressful reducing the stress, right? Like, quit your job. And then you go, huh? But how am I going to live? Well, God owns all the silver and gold. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He has a way to provide for your needs, right? Maybe he has another job that doesn't have so much stress associated with it. But it is a factor. And when I realize this and recognize this, I start talking with guests who come to our lifestyle center, and a good portion of them have developed their cancer during times of high stress. They've lost a loved one, they've gone through a divorce, they've had financial downfall, whatever it is. You know, their children are running off and doing all sorts of things, and it's just not working, right? There's issues there. And it can lead to the cancer because it impacts the immune system. The immune system is responsible for surveying what's going on. And if things start turning into cancer, it wants to take care of it early. But if the immune system can't function, yeah. When you go to your doctor, we love to do risk factor assessments. All right? We like to see how at risk you are for developing a condition, or how at risk you are for complications if you do have this situation. So we like to do things like take blood, right? So you do blood work, and you do cardiac CRP or a homocysteine level or cholesterol. You're looking at biomarkers like body mass index, how wide you are versus how tall you are. Things like blood pressure and resting heart rate, waist to hip ratios, and that kind of stuff. All of these give us an idea of how at risk you are for cardiovascular disease or its complications. Or body mass index and hemoglobin A1C and fasting blood sugar, or 2-hour postprandial glucose, these type of different things for blood sugar and diabetes. You know, how at risk are you for having these types of conditions? But if 9/10 of the diseases from which you and I suffer have their foundation in the mind, who is looking out for your mental health risk factors? When you go and see your doctor, who's checking? Well, I tell you, when I was in ER and I was doing family practice as well, I wasn't really checking. I didn't have time. You don't have time. You know, some of the hospital systems that you're in, you are allowed 8 minutes per patient. And that includes the time that you write the prescription and you do your notes, right? So you end up having just a couple minutes with the patient, and you know, so you just don't have time within that. And I am so glad I'm at Uchee Pines because I've got time. You know, we meet with you at least for an hour the first time, and then we meet with you at least for a half an hour, you know, every couple times a week. And so we spend several hours together during a session, you know, and get to know an individual and figure out what's going on, and we can look at issues of the heart as well. The relation that exists between the mind and the body is very intimate. When one is affected, the other sympathizes. The condition of the mind affects the health to a far greater degree than many realize. Many of the diseases from which men suffer are the result of mental depression. Grief, anxiety, discontent, remorse, guilt, distrust, all tend to break down the life forces and to invite decay and death. Disease is sometimes produced and is often greatly aggravated by the imagination. Many are lifelong invalids who might be well if they only thought so. Many imagine that every slight exposure will cause illness, and the evil effect is produced because it is expected. Many die from disease, the cause of which is wholly imaginary. Courage, hope, faith, sympathy, love promote health and prolong life. A contented mind, a cheerful spirit, is health to the body and strength to the soul. A merry or rejoicing heart doeth good like a medicine. In the treatment of and this is for me and physicians and other healthcare providers in the area, in the treatment of the sick, the effect of mental influence should not be overlooked. Rightly used, this influence affords one of the most effective agencies for combating disease. So we must be concerned about the issues of the heart, really issues of the mind, right? And explore into those issues because they have very profound implications in our health, right? In our health as a whole. Research shows that you have certain neuropeptides like pro-opiomelanocortin Proopiomelanocortin is a neuropeptide. It's kind of a long protein molecule, pretty big one, that is produced in the brain. And that neuropeptide can be cut a few different ways to produce different end products. If you cut proopiomelanocortin one way, it will produce beta-endorphin, which is one of your feel-good hormones, all right? Have good laughing experience. Somebody tickles you, but not too long. Other types of things like that, you've got happy experiences associated with it. Beta-endorphin. If you cut it another way, it will form ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will then stimulate the adrenal glands to release cortisol and be part of your stress response. Now, both of these pathways are okay. Back to our scenario on the safari and away from the truck and the big kitty is licking its lips. I do not want beta-endorphin at that time. Thank you very much. Give me cortisol. I want a stress response. But I don't want it all the time, right? I just want it then, right? Beta-endorphin is good too. Don't give me a stress response when I'm on a date with my wife, You like beta-endorphins. What makes the difference with how proopiomelanocortin is cut? Whether you get beta-endorphin or ACTH. What is it that decides how the physical molecule is cut? You know what the research shows? It's your thoughts. That's right. It's your thoughts. It's your thoughts and your attitudes. Your thoughts and your attitudes actually determine how the physical molecule is cut and which pathway things actually go on. So our thoughts can impact our gene expression. Our thoughts can change how very real physical molecules are cut. Our thoughts can impact inflammatory pathways and that kind of stuff. Attitude is important, vitally important, right? There's this interesting study that was done. They took 24 females, the ages of 57 to 60, who are going to be getting their flu shot for the year, and they randomized them into two groups. So randomly, 12 get into this group, and randomly 12 get into this group, And the group over here that were in this random group, all of them, they took blood samples beforehand, and then they took blood samples at 2 weeks and then 6 months after, just to make sure that they didn't have pre-formed antibodies to the flu shot, and to see how much antibodies were produced to the flu shot that was given. All of them got the same flu shot. But the group of 12 over here, they told them, think about the best thing that has ever happened to you. The best day of your life, the person that you love the most, so on and so forth. 6 minutes later, they gave them their flu shot. This group over here, they told them, think about the worst thing that's ever happened to you. The worst day of your life. The person that you hate the most. 6 minutes later, they gave them their flu shot. And what they found is that 6 months later, the group that had the 6 minutes of positive thinking had significantly elevated levels of antibodies that were produced to that flu vaccine that was given 6 months before. The reverse of that is true also, that those who had 6 minutes of negative thinking had significantly reduced antibodies produced in their bloodstream to that flu vaccine that was given 6 months before. And my conclusion of that is that 6 minutes of positive or negative thinking can impact your immune system's function for at least 6 months down the road. Wow. Wow. You mean it's that powerful? Yeah, it's that powerful. Yeah. Issues of the mind have a very powerful impact on the body, which is why Solomon said, a merry heart does good. How? Like medicine. But a broken spirit dries the bones. Proverbs 17:22. Both of those statements are true. Right? Even research shows that those who are dealing with depression and that kind of stuff are more likely to develop osteoporosis. Right? Broken spirit dries the bones. Right? But a merry heart does good like medicine. All right, let me tell you a story. This is a story that a colleague of mine told, John Torquato. He practices out in Idaho last I ran into him. And anyway, he's an internal medicine specialist. He also does lifestyle-ish stuff as well. He and his family had run a little lifestyle program out of their home for a few years. But he was here in this little town, and he tells the story of this gentleman that he came to encounter one time. And this gentleman was probably 64, 65 years of age. He was a diabetic, kind of a cattle rancher, hefty guy, you know, a man's man. And one day he noticed that he had this on the side of his foot. Right? Well, if you're a diabetic and you see something like that on the side of your foot, it's not a good thing, right? Diabetic ulcers aren't good. So what he did is he went right to the doctor. Good choice. You know, doctor looked at him, saw it, and said, okay, well, let's put you on some antibiotics. Finish the antibiotics, come back, see me, see how things are going. So he did the antibiotics, came back to the doctor, wasn't looking any better, so what the doctor did is he debrided it. So just, you know, cut the dead tissue off and get down to the good tissue. Put him on another course of antibiotics, working with him with his diabetes, because his diabetes was not under control at this point. He had been previously, but not now. And so trying to work with new medications, getting him to act, well, depending on how bad the foot is doing, trying to get him as much exercise as he can, and, you know, healthy lifestyle issues and that kind of stuff. Sugars are not getting under control, and this thing's getting worse. And eventually it gets to the point where the infection gets down to the bone. So the MRI shows that he's got osteomyelitis in the bone, and so the family doc says, okay, you need to go see the surgeon. Diabetic never wants to hear that, right? You got to go see the surgeon. So he went and saw the surgeon, and the surgeon agreed. Said the infection's to the bone. If we want to save the rest of your foot, we've got to amputate your toe. All right. So he agreed, and they did an amputation of the small toe with the bone that was infected in this area. All right? So amputated and worked on him from that standpoint. They also got a diabetologist involved, so a diabetes specialist, endocrinologist, to help out with the care with the diabetes, because he was still just not doing well with the sugars. And even with the diabetologist, they're not able to get the sugars under control. They're just working with him and can't figure out what's going on, and he's getting worse, and it gets to the next bone in the next toe. And so he sees the surgeon again, and he needs to have the next amputation. Right? So he has the next amputation. He's got 2 toes down, and he's got 3 left, but you can't just keep going toe by toe, because you can't stand on less than 3 toes. Right? So the next chop is going to be a transmetatarsal amputation right across here. Right? So the end of the foot. And so he didn't want to lose his foot. Diabetologist really doesn't want to lose his foot. Even the surgeon doesn't want him to lose his foot, you know? And so he's agonizing with this. The diabetologist decides to put him in the ICU, the intensive care unit, put him on an insulin drip, and see if they can get his sugars under control in the ICU on an insulin drip. And even in the ICU, on an insulin drip, they can't get his sugars under control. And they've been working for a long time. It's been almost 6 months, and they've been working with him, and it's just getting worse, and it's getting worse, and they can't figure what's going on. And he's seeing the surgeon one day, and the surgeon is scratching his head, and he's just like, I don't know. They said, you know what, there's this new physician in town. John had been in the area about 3 years by this time. There's this new physician in town. He does things kind of differently. Why don't you go see him and see if there's anything that he can figure out? It's funny because a lot of people do that to me too. Yeah, there's this weird guy, and you know, maybe he can figure it out. And I mean, a lot of times I can't, but I can't. But you know, it's interesting to get problematic cases like that. Anyway, so he goes to see John, and you know, John reviews his history, and he goes over the MRI reports and the X-rays and all that kind of stuff, and he looks at, you know, he's looking at the hospitalizations and the endocrinologist notes and the physician's, the primary care doctor's notes and the surgeon's notes and all this kind of stuff, all this big history that he's going through, and he just can't identify anything that they're not doing. And from a lifestyle factor, because he likes lifestyle, he's going through and checking on all these different things, and the guy's doing all the lifestyle stuff too that he can think of. But John has a survey that he gives everybody who comes in. Remember we talked about dealing with the issues of the mind, right? 9/10 of the diseases from which men suffer have their foundation here in the mind. And who's checking about mental health risk factors? Well, John checks on mental health risk factors. And because he's an Adventist and because he's read Ministry of Healing, he put a little survey together that asks about grief, anxiety, discontent, remorse, guilt, distrust, courage, hope, faith, sympathy, and love. And so each of those is listed with a definition next to it of what it is. And then it asks the person, do you have this? Never, sometimes, most of the time, always, with 1 through 7. And they can circle where, for each of these different issues. And so he looks at this survey that the guy has and he notices that one of the issues is off where it shouldn't be. And it's the issue of guilt. So he asked the gentleman, I noticed that here in your survey that, you've circled that you frequently have guilt. What's that about? And so the guy, starts, responding, and he says, well, I'm a Christian, and I know that I should be taking care of my body, and I haven't been doing a good job of it, and I just feel guilty because I think I brought this on myself. And so John was like, okay, well, how do you broach the spirituality topic without, getting somebody upset at you or getting sued? But anyways, he was like, all right, well, in your church, when you feel guilty, what do you do about it? He says, well, we pray and ask God to forgive us. So? and the man looked at his wife. His wife was there with him at the office visit, and he's like, come on, Martha. And John's thinking, oh no, they're going to get up and walk away, and they're offended because I brought up the whole spirituality issue and all that. And the man and his wife got up there, and then they knelt down in the office. And he prayed, and he asked for God to forgive him. And he got up back and sat in the chair, and both of them looking across at John like, all right, what next? And John's thinking, I don't know, what's next? And so he said, okay, well, in your church, if you pray and ask God to forgive you, what do you do then? Well, we believe that God forgave us, and we don't do those things anymore. But I'm already not doing those things anymore, right? He's already changed his lifestyle, but it's not working. John couldn't identify anything else. Nothing else. The only thing that he could pick on and that he could get was guilt. It had been 6 months since the guy first noticed the ulcer, until he had come down to 2 toes missing, an ICU visit, and a number of physicians, and all that kind of stuff. 6 weeks later, the foot was healed up.
Praise God.
I mean, he still only had 3 toes. I mean, it's not like he grew toes back, but it was healed up, and his sugars were under control.
Praise the Lord.
And the only thing identified was guilt. Now, not infrequently, when somebody comes to me at the Lifestyle Center and I recognize that there's an emotional issue or a mental issue, or not a mental like I'm crazy, but a mind issue that is underlying what's going on, I'll address the mind issue. And sometimes people will say, well, hang on, Doc. No, it's not all in my head. I really have stuff going on. And I'm going, I know you got very real stuff going on, but the foundation of the issue is in the mind, right? Just like this guy, he had very real things going on his feet, 2 toes missing. But the foundation of the issue was in the mind, right? God gave health advice in His Word. Did He not? Bring every thought into captivity to make it obedient to Christ. 2 Corinthians 10:5. That is not just good moral advice, it is health advice, right? Because when we let the mind go in other channels, it then starts to negatively impact our health too. Ephesians 4:26, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Why? Because I love you, and you're my child, and that wrath is going to kill you. Just like those medical students and those lawyers who died early from heart disease and from other causes because they had hostility, and I want to save you from that. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. So what about you? What is your attitude? Right? If I say the words strained relationship, who comes to mind? Right? If I say strained relationship, who comes to mind? What would it take to resolve those issues? And what would it take to resolve those issues now? Right? Before you even leave here. Is there a letter that you need to write? A text message that you need to send? Well, probably not. It usually needs to be more involved than that. A phone call that you need to make? Do you need to go to somebody's place and have a face-to-face conversation? What is it that you need to lay to rest so that you can come to freedom from what binds you and negatively impacts your health? Right? Tomorrow we're going to look at the first of two issues that I find to be the most prominent of mind issues that affect individuals, and especially us as Christians and Seventh-day Adventists, that affect us on a regular basis. Tomorrow we're going to look at bitterness. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people that don't think that they're bitter, that are bitter. And we'll talk about how you recognize that fact. Right? How do you recognize it? And what does it do? And then on Wednesday, we're going to look at negative thought patterns. Right? Negative thought patterns, and how do we recognize them, and how do we overcome them? Right? How do we come to freedom from these issues? Because if we don't, we're always going to be sick some way. Right? And I'm interested in not just your physical health, I'm interested in your whole health. Right? And so, if you know of other individuals that are dealing with, you know people that are bitter, don't tell them, oh, I know you're bitter, come here. Say, oh, there's this really good seminar that you need to go to, come on, come on over, learn, find out, and that kind of stuff. And we'll look at dealing with those issues. And then Thursday, natural remedies. We're going to be doing that for the first and the second session. Kitchen cabinet remedies, as well as hydrotherapy and other charcoal and that kind of stuff, things that you can use. And then we'll wrap everything up on Friday. So let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your blessings. It is amazing how powerful the impact is of the mind on the body. And as we contemplate this and we recognize our own issues, we come before you because we are incapable. And we are so in need of your grace, of your Spirit, to come in and heal us from the hurt of our hearts, that we may have freedom inside, that we may have your joy and your peace, and that we may be transformed into your likeness. And then, Lord, no matter what happens to our body, no matter what happens externally, it doesn't matter. Oh, yes, you'll take care of us. We don't have to worry about that. But if we have peace, we can weather any storm. And we can confidently look forward to your coming. Grow that hope within our hearts, we pray, as we surrender ourselves to you, as we apologize for the things that we have done wrong, as we make things right with others and have those difficult conversations, and as we come to freedom in you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.